The killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi has left the Canadian government with a dilemma. It's under pressure to cancel the $15 billion arms sale to Saudi Arabia in response, but that could come at a cost to the economy and jobs. The government is currently reviewing the entire relationship. Joining me from Toronto is Ahmed Islam, President and Executive Director of the Canada-Saudi Business Council, which advocates for stronger business ties between Canada and the Kingdom. Hi, Mr. Islam. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Sir, Saudi Arabia has been in the spotlight recently for all the wrong reasons. There, of course, was the gruesome murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and now the brutal war in Yemen is back in focus. In light of all of that, have Canadian businesses expressed concerns to you over investing or doing trade with the Kingdom?
There have been a few concerns as of late, of course. Specifically, no new business is going on. But as we were told, all previous engagements were still ongoing and unaffected, including Aramco that officially came down to Canada for the first time in April this year. So there are some concerns with respect to exports and so on, but in general, the old relationships still exist.
Are there concerns, though, over the actual events that have taken place, and specifically Mr. Khashoggi? I'm sure you're well aware of the scrutiny that the Kingdom has been facing, and that the discussion that's going on around the world. And I'm just wondering, from a business perspective, what is the conversation like among that community that you're talking with? Well,
at the end of the day, this is a specific event. It's an anomaly, to be honest. It's a national tragedy. To quote the Minister of Energy, Industry and Mineral Resources, Khalid Al-Faleh, who said that basically it's a nation in crisis, the largest crisis since 9/11. Naturally, business sentiment will be affected, but those who are there for the long term, they understand that this was something that hopefully will subside in the near future. And more importantly, as the King and the Crown Prince have mentioned, putting in new reforms and regulations that will make sure this never happens again.
Can I ask why you describe it as an anomaly?
As a nation, we're all shocked. It's not in Saudi Arabia's DNA to assassinate its own people. Had it been the case of other regimes in the region, I'm sure nobody would be that surprised. But as a nation, we are surprised.
Maybe not assassinate, but is it not in Saudi Arabia's current DNA to ostracize, to punish those who they describe as dissidents, as this man had been described?
Well, that's more political, and to be honest, I don't have much expertise in that area.
But I mean, you said it was an anomaly, and I have to for 1 second just challenge that idea, because
sure.
I think there are a lot of people who don't buy what the Kingdom is, how the Kingdom is explaining it.
Understandable. I think the context here has to be looked at, and that is basically that the region is simmering, and that there is genuine fears that war is on the horizon, and that has to be put into context with respect to certainly political activists who may choose a side or the other.
Surely you're not trying to justify what happened to Mr. Khashoggi, though.
Of course not. It's a national tragedy, and we're all shocked, and our condolences to his family, and we genuinely hope this never happens again.
What international context could there possibly be that could even remotely try to explain what happened to this man? I mean, he expressed views that were not popular with the Kingdom.
Yeah.
And he apparently, he was murdered. We don't know all the details yet, but
exactly.
there are allegations. I mean, even the president has said, U.S. President Trump has said that the explanation offered by the Saudi Kingdom doesn't really add up, and he called it a cover-up.
Understandable. It's still early days. The investigation is ongoing, and I think it's premature to implicate or to suggest involvement of people without the evidence being on the table. Now, the good news here is that a open and transparent joint investigation is going on between the Kingdom and Turkey, and I'm sure the
Do you really
justice will
feel
be
that
served.
it's open? It's transparent?
Well, within the context, I'm not sure how many open, transparent joint investigations actually occur, but that's what's been mentioned, and that's what we believe.
How does this affect the business climate? And I understand. I mean, they're very separate, but from your perspective, I mean, are you finding, if you're trying to advocate for doing more business with the Kingdom, and I understand the Canadian context is a bit different given what happened with the diplomatic dispute in the summer, but are you finding that there is pushback, for example, from Canadian businesses? Is there any?
Well, naturally, of course, in the short term, business sentiment is going to be impacted. There's no doubt about that. The question is over the long term, the more stable long-term relationships. I can imagine that there are quite a few Canadian companies who were considering the region, and this has made them pause. uncertainties in the air. But one has to look historically at the kingdom and consider that it's always been politically stable, more so than a lot of their neighbors. This is the same monarchy since the mid-18th century. So,
but aren't we just calling it stable in a comparative way? I mean, is it actually really that
yes.
stable? I mean,
yes, naturally, it's in a comparative sense. Yes.
Do you think there are any? Are there problems at the top? And obviously, we've covered how there are specific allegations, for example, to the Crown Prince, against the King. But are there, is there anything that could be done among that leadership that would salvage the uncertainty that so many businesses that businesses?
Well, it comes back to the reforms and regulations that are being put in place right now. A full investigation has occurred. You've had a significant number of people either arrested or removed from positions. So that's critical, first and foremost, as it comes from the very top. It's necessary to get the public confidence in the investigation, and the public supports the King and the Crown Prince in their undertaking.
In Saudi Arabia, they do, you mean?
Well, of course, they're nationals of the kingdom, hence they're worried about the kingdom first and foremost.
But do you think that faith in that investigation, in their capabilities, exists elsewhere in the world right now? From where I sit, it's never been questioned more.
Well, this is a unique situation. And the question is, does the kingdom have the institutions, the people, the will, and the public support for these changes to happen? And I believe that is the case. I believe they have what it takes to weather this. Of course, making sure it never happens again.
How can you be certain of that?
How can one be certain of anything? It's national confidence, an understanding of the history. Again, the context here is what's going on in the region and the fact that, it's simmering. You did mention the Yemen war, and thankfully in the last few days there has been talk about ceasefire so that the kingdom can return to brotherly relations with Yemen.
Do you think that they'll actually participate in a ceasefire? Do you think there's a will to do that at all?
There's a will to resolve the situation, but that's really between the Yemeni government, the rebels, and the international community. The kingdom, of course, has made its position clear. Bear in mind that Houthi rebels have fired more than 200 missiles into the kingdom, and it's a legitimate defensive reaction. But nobody
Although
wants
others
this
would
war.
question the legitimacy of that, but...
Well, when they're not being fired at, it's easier to take the soft side on this. And bear in mind, the kingdom is only taking a defensive position, and we're hopeful that it's resolved in the very, very near future. Regardless
of the type of, or the way in which the position is characterized, there is, of course, a lot of scrutiny over the sheer level of death and destruction in Yemen, though.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, the kingdom is genuinely concerned about that. I think it's fair to say that they provided more humanitarian aid as well as financial aid to Yemen in terms of trying to get them back on track.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I'm out of time, but thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Today, Canada also joined a chorus of countries calling for Saudi Arabia to strike a ceasefire in Yemen. It led a military intervention there 3 years ago. The conflict has left thousands of civilians dead and put the country on the brink of the world's worst famine crisis. Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs writes, Canada calls on all parties to bring a permanent end to the ongoing conflict in Yemen, which has had an unacceptable and devastating impact on children, women, and men in the country. We remain deeply concerned, she writes, by reports that all parties to the conflict have repeatedly contravened international law and have obstructed humanitarian assistance. Will this international pressure have any effect? Joining me now is Thomas Junot. He's an assistant professor at the University of Ottawa and former Middle East analyst for the Department of National Defense. Hi, Professor Junot. Nice to see you again.
Hi.
So let me ask you first about the significance of these calls for a ceasefire in Yemen. What do you think? How significant is it?
I think it's significant, but only a bit, in the sense that the fact that the U.S. would issue a statement like it did yesterday from both the Secretaries of State and Defense calling for a ceasefire and actually saying in some amount of detail how that should play out is significant, because the U.S. has not done that before. So if there is to be progress in trying to establish some kind of peace process, the U.S. has to play a role, which it hasn't done so far. So it's positive. That being said, it's important really not to get carried away, in the sense that this was a statement that was issued by the U.S. It has not taken any concrete action yet, and we haven't even had a formal reaction from Saudi Arabia, let alone from the Houthis and all the other actors in Yemen. So let's remember that this is an extremely complicated war. The different actors are deeply entrenched. Mistrust and suspicion are sky high. So it's a positive step, but it's a very small step.
Yeah, and that leads me to my next question, which is what are the chances of one actually taking hold in Yemen?
I don't see in the short term how a genuine ceasefire could actually take hold. Could we imagine in the next few days or weeks some very tentative steps whereby there's a short-term cessation of hostilities? But that's possible. But an actual deeper ceasefire where genuine work is being done to try to resolve some of the differences, I'm not optimistic in the short term because, the different actors are, again, they're so deeply entrenched, and everything that's been tried by the UN and by others so far has not worked out. Some people who are maybe a bit more optimistic than I am as of today will say, for example, the US is trying to take advantage of the fact that Saudi Arabia has been very much put on the defensive because of the whole Khashoggi scandal that really makes it look bad. Could the US try to exploit that? Perhaps, but we're still several steps away.
Let me ask you, we just had the head of the Canada-Saudi Business Council on, and he characterized the Saudi position in Yemen as a defensive one. And he also said, when I pushed back a bit and said that there had, regardless of how you characterize it, there had been a lot of death and destruction in Yemen, he said that Saudi Arabia has, no one else has supplied as much humanitarian aid there, and that they've done a lot of that. Can you sort of offer a bit of a reality check on both those statements?
Sure. On the first step, that the Saudi position is defensive, this is something that Saudi Arabia says quite a bit. In a very narrow sense, it is not completely inaccurate in the sense that Saudi Arabia as a state, right, and anybody who governs Saudi Arabia has a genuine interest in what goes on in Yemen. And instability in Yemen can actually threaten Saudi Arabia's security. That being said, Saudi Arabia's decision in 2015 to launch a massive intervention in Yemen at the head of 10 states, airstrikes, support for coalition forces on the ground, and maritime blockade and air blockade. It's a complete overreaction on Saudi Arabia's part that is partly responsible, not fully responsible, but partly responsible for the horrible humanitarian tragedy in Yemen. So to say that Saudi Arabia's position is defensive is at best very misleading and incomplete. On the second part of what was said, it is true in a narrow sense that Saudi Arabia, again, provides large amounts of humanitarian assistance in Yemen. That's not inaccurate. That being said, that's trying to extinguish the fire that Saudi Arabia is seriously contributing to, in the sense that it is itself responsible for part of that humanitarian tragedy.
And on the death of Mr. Khashoggi, the gentleman we interviewed, also he characterized it as an anomaly and seemed to think that the outcome of the investigation, the joint one between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, would be enough to settle the matter, and that it could, and that it could result in some sort of conclusion that provided enough faith to move on. To sort of characterize or paraphrase what he said. What do you think about that?
On that one, I would completely disagree without even some space for a small amount of truth. First of all, the death of Khashoggi is an anomaly? Absolutely not. First of all, Saudi Arabia has been imprisoning and executing dissidents for a long time, not only recently, but even before that, for that matter. So in that narrow sense, it's not an anomaly at all. And even more broadly than that, the assassination, because that's what it was, of Khashoggi is part of a broader pattern, not only in terms of killing dissidents, but a broader pattern of recklessness by Saudi Arabia under MBS. The war in Yemen, the blockade of Qatar, the embargo of Qatar, sanctions against Canada, de facto kidnapping the Lebanese prime minister last year. All of that has to be seen as part of a broader pattern of Saudi Arabia under MBS acting in an extremely aggressive and reckless way. The assassination of Khashoggi is entirely consistent with that broader pattern, so it is not an anomaly. On the second portion of an investigation, I have zero confidence, and literally zero confidence, that Saudi authorities will come up with any kind of fulsome, transparent, complete investigation in terms of what is going on. They've never done it before for similar cases or less similar cases, and there is absolutely no reason to think that they will do it now.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Professor Junot. Nice to see you again.
Thank you.